Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all very much for coming. My name is Richard Samuels. I'm the director of the Center for International Studies here at MIT and a professor in the Department of Political Science. Sadly, we've been here before. Some of you might remember that the center organized a public forum immediately after 9/11, and that we held another one immediately after 3/11, which was the catastrophe in Japan that claimed 20,000 lives in a matter of minutes. Our purpose then, in those meetings, as our purpose now, is to share what we know and to provide, if we can, a fuller context for the community on a crisis that affects us all. But this time, it really is different. This is a different event, a different kind of crisis. It was more personal for us here in Cambridge than any of us, I think, dared imagine. We meet today in the very near shadow of a great personal loss and unaccustomed terror at the marathon finishing line across the river, at the hospitals nearby, at the Stata Center, which is just steps away from this spot on this campus, and in the streets and in the shops by our homes. We've all been touched very directly and very deeply, first by terrorism and then by heroism. Before we begin then, I thought I'd like to ask you to join me in a moment of silence just to remember those who we've lost and to reflect for a moment on the suffering that continues for many in our community. Thank you very much. Now, some of what we've experienced has been clarified by the media and by analysts elsewhere. Still, we deserve and we want to know more. We need a context, I think, for what's been visited upon us. So as in those earlier cases, those earlier symposia, what we're going to try to do this afternoon is to bring a fuller perspective on the politics that may have shaped the views of those two young men who are accused, the one survivor who is accused of perpetrating a crime of mass terror, and the politics that are likely to be operating on others, both here and abroad. And I'm very grateful to the colleagues we've assembled here for agreeing to come together to help us reach these understandings and get this fuller understanding. Let me introduce them to you. What we're going to do is simply go straight down the line with presentations from each before we then turn it over to you for questions from the audience. So I will introduce them in order on the front end. Stephen Van Ever, immediately to my left, is the Ford International Professor of Political Science at MIT. He works on U.S. foreign policy and international relations of the Middle East. Elizabeth Wood, who sits to his left, is a professor of history at MIT, an expert in the field of Soviet history. Her work centers on the performance of power under Vladimir Putin. Carol Savitz, next in line, is a research affiliate here at the Security Studies program in the Center for International Studies, again at MIT. She's written widely on Russian policy in the Middle East and on other Soviet successor states. Bakit Beshimov is a visiting scholar at the MIT Center for International Studies, and he's deputy chairman of the Social Democratic Party of Kyrgyzstan. Peter Krause, to his left, is an assistant professor of political science at Boston College. He's, we're proud to say, a graduate of the MIT Political Science Department and a research associate here at the CIS, at the Center for International Studies. He studies international security, Middle East politics, non-state violence, and social movements. To his left, Gene Gilman is senior advisor at the MIT Security Studies program. We're all in some way or other associated with the Security Studies program at CIS. Gene's a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on WMD and works on issues regarding infectious diseases and biological weapons. She's going to speak to us about the FBI and the way it works in crises such as this. And last but certainly not least, Sylvia Dominguez is the associate professor of sociology at Northeastern University and an expert on immigration integration, on race and ethnic relations, on social networks, violence, and mental health. With those introductions, I want to turn it over to Steve and turn him to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dick. I teach classes on American foreign policy and on the causes and prevention of war, and so I'm going to focus my comments basically on what caused this attack at the marathon and what policies we might think about implementing to prevent the recurrence of an attack like this, sort of think in practical terms. Where did it come from, and what could be done to minimize the odds of similar attacks down the road? And I'm going to make 3 points. The first is this attack was in important ways caused by the al-Qaeda narrative. It happened because the al-Qaeda narrative still lives in the wider Muslim world, and I believe attacks like this are going to continue as long as that narrative is widely believed and repeated. It's not very widely believed and repeated, but it is sufficiently widely repeated and believed to cause events like this, and the U.S. hasn't taken the narrative piece of the problem very seriously in the past, and should do it. Second is that this conflict, this attack emerged from a horrible regional war, the Russian-Chechen war, and the brutality that the Russian state has inflicted on Chechnya. It illustrates the fact that the United States has an interest in peace, that wars, especially wars involving the Muslim world, but wars anywhere in the world, are gasoline for terror groups. The United States should understand that pursuing peace in whatever way is effective should be a piece of our counterterror policy. Peace should be part of national security, peace promotion. The third is that I think it's possible that this attack emerged in part because the United States and Russia are not cooperating closely on these security matters. And I think that that's happened in part because the U.S. government has chosen to adopt policies that have frayed and disrupted U.S.-Russian security cooperation in the past, including U.S.-NATO expansion, talk of further expanding NATO into the Caucasus region, national missile defense, and I think we should understand we pay a price for these policies, and we may have paid a price for it at the marathon bombing. I'm an advocate of close U.S. cooperation with all the world's major states against what I think are the biggest security problems in the world: proliferation spread, WMD terror, climate change, threats to the world's natural environment. I believe that the world's major powers all share a common interest in dealing with these problems, and the threats we pose to each other are much smaller. So and I think this event illustrates that you pay a price if you think that playing hardball with other major powers should be the main focus of foreign policy. I think that's old think. That worked for the 20th century. We ought to rethink it for the 21st. So just to run through these ideas in slightly more detail. The narrative point. Al-Qaeda today is a fragmented organization with a central core that lives on in northwest Pakistan, but is much weakened. It's only a tiny shadow of its former self. And about 5, depending on how you count, regional organizations that are in better shape institutionally. The strongest one is in Yemen, so-called AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula. But there also are franchise organizations in Somalia, Iraq, Mali, northern Nigeria, and we see a growing Al-Qaeda organization in Syria. And most talk about the terror problem sort of thinks in terms of dismantling those organizations. I think this attack did not emanate from any of them. It emanated from self-radicalizing folks in the United States who found the Al-Qaeda narrative on the internet and decided to believe it, which illustrates the broader point, which is that the quote, war on terror or war on Al-Qaeda, whatever you want to call it, must have an idea piece to it. And that piece has been missing ever since 9/11. The United States government has not taken seriously the mission of addressing and pushing back or defeating the al-Qaeda narrative. Now, the al-Qaeda narrative, what is it? It's essentially a victim narrative that argues that the last 100 years, or in another version of it, the last 1,000 years, have seen unrelenting, unprovoked, and immensely destructive onslaught by the non-Muslim world, especially the Christian world, but also the Hindu world, against the Muslim world. So there's a picture here of a wholly innocent Muslim world behaving itself perfectly and under unprovoked attack by others. And the more modern examples that are cited of this attack would be the war in Bosnia, which bin Laden cited a lot, the war in Somalia, the U.S. intervention there in '92, which is cited as an aggressive act in this narrative, the Western efforts to free East Timor, support for East Timorese independence from Indonesia, which is cited as a tearing apart of Indonesia, and of course the U.S. attack on Iraq, and of course Israeli conflict with the surrounding Arab states and the Palestinians. And then if you go back in history, previous Muslim-Christian conflicts are also cited as part of this narrative. Is the narrative true? Well, some of this aggression is, shall I say, spun quite a bit. In Bosnia, the U.S. was actually fighting on the Muslim side against Christians, but nevertheless, there's plenty of Christian, Muslim blood on Christian hands that's been accumulated down through the centuries. The main error in the narrative is what it omits, that this has been a two-sided conflict, and that down through the ages, Muslims in general and Islamists in particular have also sort of given as well as they've gotten. If you look at the Islamist record in Sudan, roughly 2 million South Sudanese have been killed by the Islamist jihadi, whatever you want to call, regime in Khartoum. Likewise in Afghanistan. So it's the sound of one hand clapping. It's a false narrative, mostly false by what it omits. But it's a very compelling narrative, very compelling. And the U.S. government has made very little effort to answer it, argue against it, refute it. The whole U.S., if you will, public diplomacy activity today is pallid. It's top folks have not been recruited to lead it. The amount of money spent on it is tiny. There's no really professionalized core of folks who conduct public diplomacy in the U.S. government that exist as a sort of separate career line. During the 1990s, Congress, under the leadership of Jesse Helms, dismantled the USIA, which was the main arm for sort of public arguing overseas, and that function then was put in a place where it couldn't thrive very well. So my main point here is I think this idea piece, the need to address the al-Qaeda narrative, is essential, and the U.S. government has made a big mistake in not addressing it so far. Now, you can counter-argue and say, well, how can the U.S. engage in an argument about sort of Mideast politics, given that the U.S. has been an aggressive actor, isn't the right religion, has misdeeds to its name, it's not a legitimate player in the whole debate. And we can argue about whether U.S. public diplomacy could be effective. But I think the history, especially the 40s and 50s, shows that in the past when the U.S. decided to focus on that activity, the U.S. has been successful at it. And to my mind, this neglect of the idea piece is part of a larger, if you will, militarization of U.S. Approaches to the terror problem. This the sort of one bumper sticker to take away is that the American approach to the terror problem is too militarized. Second point is that this conflict, this attack rather, emerged from, it's not an accident in my opinion, it emerged from Chechnya, which is a place which has seen immense violence over the last 20 years. The Russians have committed tremendous violence against the Chechen people in 2 wars in the 1990s, just destroying vast swaths of the country and killing enormous numbers of people. Chechnya was earlier ravaged by Stalin in the Second World War when the entire population was deported, and I'm forgetting the percent who were killed, but it was, I once knew, it's like a fifth. And then in the 1850s, earlier, when the Russians conquered the place, they inflicted huge violence on the place. The more recent violence, though, had a particular effect. It gave al-Qaeda an into the country. We saw in Chechnya what we've seen in some other places, which is whoever's losing a civil war is willing to make friends with really bad people out of desperation and accept their help. In Afghanistan, we saw the Taliban willing to invite al-Qaeda in the 1990s because the Taliban was having a tough time in their war against the Northern Alliance, and they needed al-Qaeda's military help and their expertise and their money, so they allowed them to come in and develop bases. And it was from those bases that they organized the 9/11 attack. Same thing happened in Chechnya. The Chechens were desperate for help against the Russian attack and allowed al-Qaeda folk to join them in their effort, and this gave the al-Qaeda operatives an opportunity to infest the society and make friends and influence people, and to recruit Chechens into al-Qaeda conflict elsewhere, especially in South Asia. This argument, it's part of a larger argument that one of our MIT PhD students has made. I think it's a terrific thesis that she's writing. Stephanie Kaplan is writing a dissertation arguing that wars anywhere are gasoline for al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, especially if they involve Muslims, al-Qaeda loves to use wars anywhere involving Muslims for propaganda, but also for networking, as occasions to enter into a war scene, make new friends, develop new contacts, extend their organizational reach, for training also, and for fundraising also. And my deduction from all that is the United States should have a peace policy toward any conflict, especially conflicts involving Muslims. The United States should see it as a part of its war on terror to promote Arab-Israeli peace, to promote India-Pakistan peace in Kashmir, to do its best, I think we've done a lousy job of it, do its best to leave Iraq in a peaceful state, and to calm other conflicts in the region. And if you want to ask me about Syria, that's a conflict today that I think has no easy answer, but if there were one, we should pursue it. My third point is that and here I'm guessing, this is really, I'm more, on much shakier ground here, but when I look at the structure of what happened over the last several years involving the Tsarnaev family, we know the Russians did not fully cooperate with the United States on this case from the get-go. When the Russians queried the U.S. to run the Tsarnaevs through their files, they didn't explain why. And when the U.S. went back to the Russians and asked them, why are you guys curious about the Tsarnaevs, they didn't answer. Which illustrates to me, lack of tight intelligence cooperation. Then we know that later, the elder Tsarnaev went back to Dagestan, and it's a bit odd. We haven't heard weren't the Russians watching, following, learning things? Certainly they didn't communicate anything they did learn to the USA. And to me, my observation on that is, and what do you expect? U.S. relations with Russia, not too good. The U.S. has been sort of pursuing a hardball policy toward Russia since the 90s with, as I said, the two policies I think you should question the most are the NATO expansion, which I think was a terribly unwise thing to do. Further talk of NATO expansion into the Caucasus, into the idea of including Ukraine and Georgia, which I think would be very unwise, and then national missile defense. So to my mind, there's a price for not pursuing full détente with other powers, and I think we may have paid it. So I will stop there and let Elizabeth Wood add some thoughts.
Hard act to follow. Okay, so this is a very complicated topic, and we don't have all the information yet, right? We know that there's a lot of pieces we don't know. Yesterday in the Boston Globe, veteran reporter Kevin Cullen, whose work I like a lot, said, "You may have noticed I'm not using the Tsarnaev brothers' first names. That's because I'm in the process of forgetting them. I don't want to remember their names. I want them to vanish from my memory bank." He said he wanted to remember instead the victims. Today, I want to work a little bit with the story of Tamerlane and Jahar Tsarnaev, of Anzor and Zubaidat, the parents, not as individuals. We don't know enough. I've been, searching to see what we could find out, but as part of a history that we need to know. Unless we understand the perpetrators of violence as individuals situated in history, as individuals situated in causes and conditions that are larger than their own biographies, we cannot understand what happened last week at the Boston Marathon. I want to use the story of these two young men as a window to understand this difficult and troubled part of the world. And of course, I'm going to be joined very much by Karel Savitz, who's going to talk about the last 20 years in more detail, and Bakit Beshimov, who is actually from Kyrgyzstan and can talk about the situation in the region from a first-hand perspective. But let me do, as a veteran teacher, my students have been fascinated. We stopped all other discussion after the bombings to say, let's talk about what happened. What I want to start with is a map, because I think unless we understand the geography, there's a lot we won't understand. My main theme is going to be to understand the difficulties of this. Oops, sorry. I went back. It's not supposed to happen. To understand the difficulties of this region caught between at the edge of Russia with resources that everybody wants and as a crossroads up in the mountains. So first, let me see how I do this. First, we need to see that Chechnya and Dagestan are between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. This is a close-up of the region. You can see the sheer number of different auls, villages, cities, towns. This is a region with over, actually, if you actually count them properly, some 20 different nationalities with languages that are not even cognate to each other. The scientists, I always say to my students, I don't know if this is actually true linguistically, it's a little bit like different species of squirrels. When you live in the high mountains, it's very easy to develop different linguistic patterns. Here's the geography, and you can see that the mountains lead from Sochi in the west, which is a not insignificant part of the story, I'm convinced, all the way practically to Baku in the far east, another oil capital. And then the other thing I want to show you is that while Chechnya is fairly ethnically homogeneous, Dagestan is one of the least ethnically homogeneous, most heterogeneous places in the world. And one of its problems in this post-Soviet period is trying to deal with the fact that they've got 10, 20 different nationalities in a very small area. So what I want to talk about today is a little bit of the back history, since I've got esteemed colleagues who can talk more about the current history of the Russian North Caucasus conflict. The other thing I didn't say is that these mountains are 18,000 feet high. These are some of the highest mountains in the world. They're higher than the Alps. They're extremely difficult to cross, and there's only a few key passes. And the other thing I want to say is that in terms of religion, the North Caucasus has historically been Muslim since the 18th century. We have earlier roots. But what's important is that especially Chechnya and Dagestan were Sufi Muslims. In other words, Sufism was a spiritual religion and a political religion in the sense that the head of state was an imam, but it was not an expansionist, it was not a radical, it was not a violent religion. It was a contemplative religion. So we'll talk about that. The tension between the Russians and the Chechen and the North Caucasians goes back as far as Peter the Great. I like to think of it in a way as a tension between the peoples of the steppe, the flatlands. The Russians live in the forest in the far north, and then adapted to the steppe in the 15th, 16th centuries as they began to push back the Mongols and the Tatars and the other peoples of this region. The mountain lifestyle is very different. It's based on clans and loyalties. The two regions have been coming into conflict both over territory and sovereignty, which we also need to talk about, and also over oil and gas. As it turns out, the region right above Grozny has an oil field. I wonder if there were not oil right here, and also right up here, would the Russians might they be more willing to let it go if there were not oil? And the Nazis also were going for the oil when they came in. Peter the Great had begun a push toward the south after he had, his main great successes, I always tell my students, was to get the northern sea and build St. Petersburg. He hoped to get to the southern part. He couldn't. At that point, it was still controlled by many different migratory peoples. It's really the Tsars Alexander I and Nicholas I, who began in the early 19th century, who engaged in what were called the Caucasian Wars, or sometimes the Murid Wars. Muridism is the name for, is a Sufi term that means the committed one, which means from a root of willpower or self-esteem. And a murid is one who follows a teacher on a spiritual path. So again, we see that even the wars had a spiritual dimension, as the Chechens, the Dagestanis, the Avars, all the peoples of this region attempted to defend themselves against what they felt were the incursions of the Russians. I think it's interesting that the Russian Empire was able to annex Georgia and Armenia and parts of Azerbaijan before they were able to annex the Northern Caucasus. Georgia was annexed in 1801, Armenia in 1828. Parts of this region were annexes in the 1810s, but Chechnya held out till the death of Imam Shamil in 1859. At the capture of Shamil in 1859. So it's also interesting that when you study, if Russians talk about their history, what they remember is the War of 1812, when they beat Napoleon, the great superpower of the day. They were not at this time able to beat the smaller nations of the Caucasus because of the terrain, because of the distances, and because of the fierce fighting and deep antithesis between the two. The other thing that's interesting, and I'm not an expert on this, but I'll just tell you what some other scholars have said, is that there's a way in which the Murid Wars, these wars to get control of this region, brought together Islam and religious nationalism as a unifying force in a way that hadn't been true before. That what these republics, these regions that all spoke different languages, begin to realize is that what they have in common is Islam. And they begin to fight back on those grounds. The flip side, unfortunately, is that the Russians bring to this 19th century a profound sense of mission of their own role as Christians, as Orthodox, as the Third Rome. That's part of their great claim to rule, to convert. The story of the conversion is very complicated, but they were definitely massively trying to convert these peoples to Orthodoxy. And it became so ingrained in the culture that when I was in 12th grade and in studying Russian from an emigre, I learned a song by Lermontov, the great Russian poet, called the Cossack Lullaby, that begins, sleep, my little one, sleep, my baby. When you grow up, you will be a great Cossack. You will lead the people. And it has a very sweet melody. If I wasn't intimidated, I would sing it for you. I do for my classes. But the scary part is it then goes on to say, it's the nanny singing. When you grow up, you'll leave, and I will cry for you in secret tears, because I will wave bravely, but I will cry secret tears. And then you will be in at the Terek River, and the evil Chechen will crawl onto the banks of the river with the dagger in his teeth. So children grew up hearing this lullaby, which is very sweet and says, "Bayushki bayu, go back to sleep, my little one, go to sleep, go to sleep," hearing about the evil Chechen crawling onto the banks. And this means that the Russian, and today in Moscow and Petersburg, the police are constantly checking for passports for people from the Caucasus, who they. So there's become but it's not a new racism, is the point. There's an older piece to it that, of course, is much deepened by the conflicts of the 1990s. There are two great works of literature for anybody who's interested, one of which I teach. One is Haji Murad by Tolstoy, which is a great anti-war declaration. And the other is Lermontov's Hero of Our Time. The Soviets had made Chechnya into a so-called autonomous republic after they had declared their independence. World War II, the Germans were heading for Grozny. What they wanted was oil for their military operations. They got as far as Maikop, but then were pushed back in 1943. The sad thing is that at that point, there had been some uprisings, but Stalin declared that the entire Chechen people were responsible, the entire Ingush people, the Karachay people, all of the peoples of the North Caucasus, and he instituted what in English is known as Operation Lentil. And the reason it was called Operation Lentil was that the Russian word for lentils is chechevitsa. It's an ordinary food. It's the lentil, brown lentils. Chechevitsa, his Operation Chechevitsa was to get the Chechens and to get the English. They were deported 480,000 Chechens, plus about 200,000 other North Caucasians were deported in trucks and boxcars, the same kinds of boxcars that the Nazis used in against the Jews and Gypsies and homosexuals. About 20 to 25% of the population died en route and under the terrible conditions when they arrived. Some 100,000 of the Chechens went to Kyrgyzstan. More of them went to Kazakhstan, but some went to Kyrgyzstan. It wasn't until 1957 that Nikita Khrushchev let them go back. So one other quick thing I want to do is take a quick look at the Tsarnaev family, which it's too much to do in the time I have, but what we do know, putting this together, is that I think the first fact is not quite right. We don't know where the Tsarnaev family were deported to. An early source I saw thought they went to Kyrgyzstan. It's a little less clear than that. What we do know is that the parents of Tamerlane and Jakhar moved around constantly, at least according to Kyrgyz sources that I was looking at, Russian sources. They seem to have started out in Kalmykia, which is just to the north of Dagestan and Chechnya, where the parents were at university. The father is Chechen, the mother is Avar, another ancient people of the region. Tamerlane was born in Kalmykia. The family probably then moved to Kyrgyzstan, where Jakhar was born in 1993. But they also moved, they were in Chechnya at one point in there. They may have been in Dagestan even then in 2000. Then in 2001, they go to Dagestan. Jakhar doesn't even get to finish first grade. In March of 2002, the parents take him to the States. The brother and two sisters seem to have stayed. It's not the details that matter. It's the fact that in those years, as we'll hear more when Carol tells us, 1990s, the reason they left Chechnya, assuming that the sources are correct and that's where they were, was because of the violence. That's what drove them to Kyrgyzstan, which at the time was going through its own impoverishment, struggles to get started. And in 1995, there was a famous incident in Dagestan, the Budyonovsk hospital crisis. So there's been sort of crisis after crisis of moving from nationalism to where the region, the thing to say about this region is that much of the initial fight for independence from the Russians had to do with nationalism. And later, it had more to do, I would argue, with it becomes an Islamic war precisely because of the weakness that Steve Van Evera was just telling you about. Makhachkala becomes known for its weekly shootouts, for its murders. We've just had 5 Islamic radicals have been shot by the Russian authorities in the last week. So the thing I want to end on, the note I want to end on, is to think about the ways Russia may respond. Will they use this as an excuse in advance of the Sochi Olympics, which are 10 months away? February 2014, we will see the beginning of the Olympics. To what extent will they then be saying, oh yes, it's like 2000, what they did after 9/11 was to say, oh yes, we share this common bond around terrorism, so we have to share this bond around the new terrorism, and now you will understand us and you will condone violence. And I would say to that there are two things. One is we must not give in to those who say that this 19-year-old who's been dragged around should be treated as an enemy combatant. He had U.S. citizenship. And we must not give in to the saber rattlers who say we need another war. And we must not give in to saying, oh yes, Russia should have a free hand. There's probably not much we can do, but we should keep an eye on them because the human rights issues may well be significant. So, turn it over to Carol.
Great, fits together.
Too short.
You know, we academics never have enough time to say what we want to say. Without much planning, what I have to say actually follows beautifully from what Steve and Elizabeth have already talked about. You know, we didn't know, Elizabeth and I did, but the average American citizen did not know a lot about Chechnya. We may have heard about the wars in the 90s. We didn't pay much attention to it. And I'm hoping that what I can say will give some context to what we've all been reading in the paper. I think some of it's been outright wrong. I heard one guy on MSNBC tell me that Chechnya was in the middle of Central Asia, which is Elizabeth's map show us it's not. And at least it hasn't been nuanced enough. But I have to say that my first reaction was, oh my God, the Chechen wars have come to Boston. The Chechens, as Elizabeth has talked about, are a fiercely independent peoples. They resisted the czars, they resisted the Soviets, and now they've resisted Vladimir Putin and the post-Soviet military. And as Elizabeth has told us, it's not only the Chechens, but other groups of peoples in the North Caucasus who have been resilient and have resisted the sort of Russianization and the Sovietization of the area. And even when they were defeated, the Chechens maintained their sort of resiliency and their independent spirit over the years. As Elizabeth also mentioned, Joseph Stalin saw the Chechens as bandits who continued to raid in the region and everything, and some 35,000 Chechens were purged. This is before the deportations. Were purged in 1933, and another 14,000 were purged in the late 1930s. But as both Steve and Elizabeth have alluded to, there were these mass deportations in the beginning of 1944. They were deemed to be untrustworthy peoples and therefore shipped off quite literally to Kazakhstan and to Kyrgyzstan. Which is why, as Elizabeth said, we think the Tsarnaev family wound up in Kyrgyzstan, at least for part of its time. They were permitted to return under Khrushchev in the late 1950s. And I think it's also important, and I want to emphasize what Elizabeth already said, that a lot of the Chechens are Sufi. Sufism is a kind of mysticism. They are not Salafists. They are not radical Islamists. But as Steve alluded to, I think that radical Islam has sort of taken hold in part of it. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Chechnya declared its independence, and there was this anomalous period between 1991 and 1994 when the first Chechen War began, where Chechnya was independent, conducting a foreign policy, conducting its own affairs, and Yeltsin and his entourage basically did nothing about it. Now, what you have to realize is that this was a period in which Yeltsin was trying to consolidate his hold on power in the Russian Federation, which, by the way, is composed of 89 regions and autonomous oblasts. And Yeltsin famously told the leaders of all of these republics, they're like the states of the United States, to take as much sovereignty as you could swallow. And some of the other Muslim republics within the Russian Federation said, okay, we're going to, basically be quasi-independent, much more autonomous. Tatarstan at this point was a great success. And Chechnya, for whatever reasons, was then invaded by the Russians at the end of 1994. I've never heard a satisfactory explanation as to why, for the first 3 years of post-Soviet Russia, Chechnya was allowed to sort of exist in this limbo status, and all of a sudden, the Russians sent in the troops. There's one theory that there were fighting among clans in Chechnya, and the representative of one of the clans was part of Yeltsin's entourage, and so he egged them on to go in to try to settle scores locally. And Pavel Grachev, who at that point was the defense minister, also is famously quoted as saying, it'll take a week and we're going to mop up. Didn't quite work out that way. I should mention as well that the first post-Soviet president of Chechnya was Zhokhar, not the name, Dudayev, who was actually a Soviet military hero of the Afghan wars. And given the time frame, I'm not surprised, or I'm surmising here, I don't know, that Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was named after this Chechen hero at the time. So this first war was a violent war. Basically, they destroyed beautiful downtown Grozny. I'm joking, I'm being a little sarcastic here. But in effect, the Russian army could not subdue the area, and they basically withdrew with their tails between their legs. And when they withdrew in 1996, there was a peace plan in place. They were supposed to give money to the Chechens to rebuild what had been destroyed. And in 2000, there was supposed to be a referendum on independence for Chechnya, neither of which happened. I have to tell a personal story here. At some point in the mid-90s, there was this really crazy lady running around the Boston area who somehow got hooked up with the Chechens and claimed that she was a representative of the Chechen people in the United States. So sitting at Harvard, it was what was then the Russian Research Center, a bunch of us sat in a room with a telephone hookup to Dzhokhar Dudayev. And I remember asking him, each of us got a chance to ask a question. I remember asking him, well, do you regret having sort of fought for independence as opposed to taking the path that Tatarstan did? And he said, absolutely. If only he had known, he would have pursued a very different course, which I thought was very sad because he was eventually assassinated by Russian authorities because he liked to use his cell phone a little too much, and they could track him. And the next Chechen leader was also assassinated by the Russian. Now, between 1996, which is the end of the First Chechen War, and 1999 into 2000, the beginning of the Second, Chechnya basically dissolves into total anarchy. There is infighting among clans, there is infighting among Salafists, among Sufis, among secular nationalists, etc. And some of this was actually encouraged by outside Islamist forces, which brings me to agree pretty much with what Steve says. We know that jihadis from the Middle East, particularly a guy named Khattab, who was a Jordanian, went in and helped the Chechens. And the Chechens went to other places to fight, and now we know there are some Chechens fighting with the rebels in Syria. Just a contemporary note there. At the same time, if you go back and look at newspapers, there were beheadings, there were kidnappings. Kidnapping became a big business in Chechnya at the time. So in the summer of 1999, some Chechen Islamists went and invaded Dagestan next door. Elizabeth, I'm so glad you brought maps. Allegedly to help Islamist forces there that were fighting against the Russians. But one thing that Elizabeth didn't mention is that there were mysterious bombings of apartment buildings in Moscow in the summer of 1999. The KGB or the FSB alleged that it was perpetrated by Chechens. There are still rumors to this day, if you look at some of even the Russian press coverage, but certainly the Western press coverage, that this was actually engineered by the FSB, the successor to the KGB, because this was just as Vladimir Putin was becoming first prime minister and then acting president as Yeltsin stepped aside. And the working hypothesis of people who allege this is that the Chechen War was going to be a chance for Putin to burnish his credentials and show that he was a great nationalist for the Russian people against these dastardly Chechens whom the Russians have been fighting for centuries. Putin's conduct of the war was even more ruthless than his predecessors. But this time, I guess we could say the Russians were successful. By 2007, give or take, the war basically petered out, but not before the Chechens took the fight to other parts of Russia and to Moscow itself. There was the siege of the hospital that Elizabeth alluded to. There was the theater siege, if you can think back into the early 2000s. There was Beslan, which was the school siege in 2004. There have been bombings in Pushkin Square in Moscow. There have been bombings in the Russian metro, etc. But the war ended with a Putin ally, Mr. Kadyrov, being in charge. They basically pacified and have rebuilt the area. The irony to me is that here is Kadyrov, Putin's ally, now talking about implementing Sharia law, which Putin's not very happy about in Chechnya. But with Chechnya pacified, the insurgency has spread to Dagestan and even further afield into some of the other little territories in that part of the world. It's kind of a low-level insurgency, but the targets are, there are bombings all the time. Police stations, local authorities, and until very recently, also civilians both there and again in Moscow. If you think back to 2011, there was a major bombing in the arrivals terminal at Domodedovo Airport, which is the one I always fly into. And when I was there afterwards, you could definitely see the remnants of the attack. The interesting thing, and here I think we can argue that what happened in Boston is not a direct result of what was happening there, is that the head of this Islamist insurgency in the North Caucasus in 2012 called for the cessation of all attacks against civilians. So this war is still going on, but the targets are now only police stations and authorities and stuff like that. There's not this arbitrary taking of hostages in other places. So what I want to do with the time I have left is to talk a little bit about what this means for U.S.-Russian relations and try to answer the question about whether we should care what's going on in the North Caucasus or not. The first thing to note is that when 9/11 happened, Putin seized the opportunity to say to us, okay, we're now in the same boat, basically. You have your terrorists, we have our terrorists, and he hoped that the West would stop criticizing the conduct of the war in Chechnya. There are, of course, links to international terrorism. Steve's mentioned some of this. There were some of the so-called Afghansi who went to Chechnya to fight, and the Chechens are now in Syria, apparently. And Ayman Zawahiri, whose name I can never pronounce, also apparently traveled to the North Caucasus in the mid-1990s and was arrested by the Dagestani authorities on visa violations for 6 months. Some scholars note that among the Islamist literature and everything of the region is anti-Semitism, anti-Westernism. Some say that the people in the region, those who were involved in the fighting, believe that there were two Satans, Russia and the United States. But other people argue that this insurgency is really local. The issue is independence, the issue is sovereignty, the issue is sort of Russia get out and leave us alone. It really has nothing to do with the other wars that are going on. The Boston events have also raised questions, as Steve mentioned, about intelligence sharing between Russia and the United States. The Russians weren't forthcoming, even after they asked the FBI to check up on these guys. And if they were so suspicious, why the hell did they let Tamerlane go back to Dagestan for 6 months, not arrest him, and not do anything about it? One of the problems, apparently, is that the local authorities, the Russians multiply these intelligence agencies, that they don't talk to each other. I mean, we have some problems with that too, but they don't seem to talk to each other. The deputy head of the Security Council of Dagestan said that Tsarnaev had spent only 4 days there. Now, we know he was there, give or take, 6 months. He did apparently meet with one of the known local recruiters, a guy whose name is Mahmoud Nidal, and the latter was killed in an anti-terrorist raid in 2012 while Tamerlane was in Dagestan. The interesting thing, and here we get some sensitivity, is that the Chechen leader Kadyrov has condemned the attacks in Boston. The Chechen leader in exile, because they don't get along with each other, also condemned the attacks. But this is a big deal for both Russia and the United States. Russia is hosting the Olympics in Sochi, which is on the Black Sea, so it's really in that region. It's very close to it. And this was an attack on an open sporting event. So there are parallels, in a sense, to the Olympics, and I think Russia's got to be very careful about what happens in Sochi in next year. Apparently, within the last couple of weeks, there's been enhanced intelligence cooperation between the United States and Russia. Obama and Putin spoke on the phone the other day. They agreed that their intelligence services to cooperate, and Obama said yesterday at his press conference that the suspiciousness between, the suspicion that exists between the two services was declining. Now, where I think I disagree with Steve, and we can certainly talk about this, is that I actually blame the rupture of relations between Russia and the U.S. on both sides. I agree with you that missile defense and NATO expansion was a no-no and definitely irritated the Russians, but just let me quote from Putin does this annual call-in conference. He was on the phone for, TV for 4.5 hours, calling in from Russian citizens. And about the bombings in Boston, he said, but the problem is not nationality, absolutely, or in religion. We already have said that many times. The problem is the extremist sentiments of these people. They arrived in the United States. They were given citizenship. The younger brother was a U.S. citizen. And what have they decided now? They've gone so far, not the U.S. leadership, but some U.S. politicians, as to speak of declaring the surviving criminal a prisoner of war. They are totally nuts. Now, this is Vladimir Putin talking about the U.S. government, or at least U.S. politics. So the question is, what do we do now? We kind of have our hands full. We're concerned about Syria. We're getting out of Afghanistan. Iraq is crumbling. So I'm not sure that it's sort of on our plate to get involved in any way, shape, or form in the North Caucasus. And the other piece of it is that Putin is very jealous of Russian sovereignty, and I don't think he would be very happy if we want to build better relationship if we ever got actively involved there. So I think the way forward probably is intelligence sharing and trying to figure this out. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here. At the moment, Chechen president and Russian officials have openly distanced themselves from Tsarnaev's brothers, claiming that the Tsarnaevs are America's homegrown terrorists. Partly this is understandable. The two brothers have lived and studied in America for a long time. But this debate is of little importance without deep understanding of a real situation in Chechnya and the broader Caucasus and Central Asian region. Therefore, I was invited to share my insights on this matter. But I made my focus more narrow, and I would like to share with you my answers to three key questions, which I think are very important to understand this case. First, number one, what makes young American Chechens adopt extremist views? Number two, does their connection to the Russian Caucasus and Central Asia influence their worldview? And number three, what triggers extremist American Chechens to turn to violence? I have two assumptions. First, that the Tsarnaevs became extremists under the influence of jihadist ideas, and that this extremist identity was one of their own choosing. However, and this is my second assumption, that Tsarnaev's increasing addiction to jihadism was cunningly used by forces of whom the Tsarnaevs were not aware. I spent all these days after the event trying to understand the mindset of especially Tamerlan Tsarnaev and analyze all his traces in internet and close examination of his and their web activity on YouTube in Russian and in English, Twitter, the Russian Facebook clone Vkontakte, and the websites of Chechen Mujahedins, Kafka Center, sites like Islam IU, and many others, which both brothers visited frequently, suggests that elder suspect in the years prior to Boston bombings desperately searched for identity and meaning of life. And of course, searching for meaning and identity is a normal process for young men, young immigrant making their life in America. But the problem is that his inner search was hugely, in my view, affected by the struggle in his home country, Chechnya, jihadism in the Caucasus, and the global radical Islamic ideology. The long history of the Chechen resistance against Russian occupation, the violent deportation of Chechens by Stalin to Central Asia and to my home country, Kyrgyzstan, during World War II, and the recent wars and guerrilla warfare with Russia teach Chechens to sacrifice their lives and use violence with no hesitation for the common interests of their nation. This mindset, I think, puts many Chechens into a vicious circle of revenge. Probably the elder brother was gravitated by this circle of people and ideas and didn't look beyond it. Even in America, it was difficult for Tamerlan to escape from the ideological pressure of Chechen jihadists who sacrificed their lives for Chechen independence. His YouTube collection of songs by Chechen freedom fighters is some evidence of that. We also know about Tamerlan's increasing interest in Islam. Islam in Chechnya and Dagestan in the course of the extremely brutal Chechen-Russian wars, which were increasingly influenced by Arab Muslim fighters, got seriously infected by Salafism and Wahhabism, two radical ideologies. I discovered that Tamerlan Tsarnaev embraced notions of identity that were based on two abstract jihadist perceptions. The first, life on earth is only a temporary shelter. And second, as such, devote your life to jihad. In the last 15 years, I have met many young men from post-Soviet Central Asia and Caucasus with this attitude to life. Young men who are drawn to conservative and extreme versions of Islam. Zealots of these strains believe that America is at war with Islam. Equally important, they blame not only the United States government, but also the people that elected. This partly explains why they made the choice to attack innocent citizens. As America rebounds from this tragedy, I hope that cooperation with Russia on the matter of Islamic terrorism will be more transparent and balanced. There are no illusions, in my view, are made about the questionable policy of Vladimir Putin toward Chechnya. Russia uses state terror and the tyrannical rule of the president of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, to deter jihadists in Chechnya and the Caucasus. I know many evidences how Russian governments has been used Chechen extremists for their own political purposes and against their opponents abroad. This kind of controversial policy, in my view, escalates tensions, perpetuates the cycle of violence, and provides moral support for jihad. The United States and Russia cooperation on this matter should be interesting from a historical perspective. During the Cold War, both countries created and directed various terrorist organizations. But can we be sure today that such Cold War stratagems are things of the past? I spent 15 years in relation with the military and security of countries such as Russia, China, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and of course, all former Soviet republics. As a member of parliament, initiated investigation of drug trafficking from Afghanistan and through Central Asia to Russia and Europe. Was representative of my country to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And of course, we discuss a lot the problem of terrorism and extremism in Central Asia and Caucasus, and spent years in working with the staff of Organization for Islamic Conference in Cairo. And of course, one of the main priorities of this organization was terrorism. And spent 5 years in South Asia, visiting Afghanistan and Pakistan, and trying to understand the causes of this terrorism and drug trafficking. I'm telling about that because due to a time limit, if you want to ask more, I can share with you more information, which is really very much connected to this case. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to the Center for National Studies for having me here. It's nice to be back, although obviously I wish the circumstances were a bit better. But I study political violence, so you kind of live every day kind of hoping to be put out of business, and unfortunately reality doesn't let that happen. So I'm coming at this from a bit of a different perspective than some of the great speakers beforehand who have talked about the historical context, the geographical context of Chechnya. My background, the classes that I teach on, the research I do, is on political violence and terrorism, why individuals and groups commit violence, what the effectiveness of that violence is, what are some of the dynamics and strategies that groups use to do this type of stuff. And so I'll try to provide a little insight on the Boston Marathon bombings in that regard. The first point is some of you guys have probably heard about a lot in the news, this idea of lone wolves, the extent to which the individuals who committed this attack, are they connected to an organization? Were they lone wolves, people who we generally refer to as self-starters, perhaps self-radicalizers, individuals who decided to commit these attacks but not at the behest or perhaps with any training from a armed organization. A couple things on that. There's some good news and there's some bad news from the perspective of peace-loving citizens here in this room, which I assume most of us are. The first is that the bad news for lone wolves is that obviously as we think about, they're very hard to identify, they have easy access to soft targets, and perhaps most importantly, they can turn us against each other. We can start to worry that our neighbor or someone near us is someone who might try to kill us or commit a bombing for a political end. And so in that sense, lone wolves are kind of a scary thing. They're not necessarily someone who's easy to identify and again can lead to false identification, which can be a much bigger problem than even the bombing itself can be. On the good news end, the number of people who are actually killed or targeted in lone wolf attacks each year in the United States is under 100. If you compare that to the 35,000 Americans who die each year in car accidents, or even the 55 or so who die each year in lightning strikes, it's actually quite a small number in terms of the number of people who have been killed by lone wolf attacks. So for the most part, the people who have launched these attacks are actually phenomenally incapable. There's actually a couple of articles out there in the mainstream media and in scholarly work that says basically the case for calling them idiots or morons, in the sense that they oftentimes can't build bombs, they can't build a detonator. Even guys like Faisal Shahzad, who tried to blow up in Times Square a few years ago, had some training in Waziristan, was unable to set off a successful attack. And so most of the time, these people, even if they're dreamers who want to commit these big attacks, are usually not very successful at doing so. In that sense, these two brothers here, to the extent that they committed these bombings, and it seems that there's overwhelming evidence that they did, they're actually the anomaly as opposed to the rule in terms of people who are actually able to build bombs that killed individuals and perhaps had some type of impact. In terms of talking about this, though, going forward, and today we just saw news about 3 new arrests, perhaps related to these bombings. Again, it's unclear the extent to which they're lone wolves. I might actually introduce a term which I haven't seen anywhere, but maybe it'll catch on. They're kind of more like perhaps gray wolves in the sense that they're not lone in the sense that they just did this all on their own. It's possible the older brother had training either when he was over in Russia, or perhaps there's a lot of talk about these guys maybe read the Al-Qaeda English language online magazine Inspire, which has this incredibly kind of humorous titled article, How to Build a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom. If you speak Arabic, you recognize that that's just kind of a bad English translation. But the basic idea was, here's how you can build a bomb using pressure cookers or other types of things you can buy in a basic hardware or cooking store. And there's some thought that maybe that was how these individuals learned about how to build this. Although in recent days, there's been more intel from FBI sources saying that perhaps they had some training because of specific aspects of how they built the bomb. Nonetheless, long and short of it, lone wolves, a very scary proposition in one sense, at least to this day, in terms of the number of people who have actually been killed, not nearly as terrible as we might think. Now, second point, and this actually goes to the religious point that Steve and a couple of others have brought up, And I think these are both really important points, but you rarely hear them in the same place, and I think it's worth saying them even though that they might sound somewhat familiar in different form. The first is that the vast majority of Muslims in this country are peaceful and very proud Americans. And if you think about what's happened after these attacks, beyond just looking into religion as being a source of the bombing, and I think that that's a potential thing to look at, and we'll talk about that in a second, it's also important to note that there were a number of hate crimes that happened here in our community, people who assaulted this woman who's a Palestinian doctor who lives in the area, and these are the types of things that I think as a community, first in terms of American values, we need to speak out against, but additionally, we need to think about, even if, for some reason you don't like people who are of a certain religion, when you think about why these attacks actually get prevented, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the community speaks out against this type of violence or drops dimes on individuals who are doing these types of things or planning these types of things. So going forward, thinking about having a community that has a stake in the United States or elsewhere is very, very important at integrating individuals who are refugees or immigrants, even if your sole goal is try to prevent attacks like this. So on the one hand, I think that's a key point regarding religion. On the other end of things, the people who often talk in that regard don't talk about the fact or like to hide the fact, perhaps, that religion played a role here. And you have to look at how people are claiming attacks or what they're saying their motivations were, but I think there's mounting evidence that religion, at least as these individuals portray it, did play a role here. And so in that sense, even though many of us in this room might say, well, Al-Qaeda is not following true Islam, or the Lord's Resistance Army in Africa is not following true Christianity, even though they claim Christian roots for their attacks, I don't think it's something that we should just ignore and put our heads in the sand about. I think that we need to engage with this, even if our ultimate objective or strategy is not, well, the United States should be getting involved in debates about Islam, which Steve eloquently talked about, and that's something that we can discuss more in the Q&A. All right, now in terms of some of the things that I actually feel like I study and have a little bit to say, one is the effectiveness of terrorism or political violence. What do attacks like this actually achieve? I think one of the first things you can think about it in terms of three different levels of analysis. You've got tactical effectiveness, organizational effectiveness, and strategic effectiveness. Actually, I should kind of do those up the line because they're higher levels of abstraction. Tactical effectiveness is simply being able to carry out a bombing, being able to actually, detonate a bomb, perhaps kill some people. And as I say, the vast majority of attacks that are thought about in the United States never even reach this level. A lot of these individuals are captured in FBI stings or otherwise unable to even have tactically effective attacks. But beyond that, it's actually even much more difficult to have organizational or strategically effective violence. Organizationally effective violence is violence that actually gains recruit or popular support for an organization. Strategically effective violence is violence that actually gets concessions from a target government. So in the case of Al-Qaeda, it could be United States withdrawal from the Middle East. In the case of these individuals, again, there hasn't been claiming, but they perhaps want the United States to also remove itself from the Middle East, or perhaps not support the Russians in Chechnya, although again, we're not really doing that in any case. But for the most part, most terrorist attacks or political violence attacks are actually phenomenally unsuccessful in terms of their strategic impact. So it's important to think about that, not just to get some perspective, but also to understand that we as a community actually hold the key in terms of strategic effectiveness for this use of violence. We get to decide whether at the end of the day, we're going to make concessions, we're going to change the way our society operates, or not. They have the ability to potentially kill people, but if we're going to make an outsized difference politically in terms of what the impact of their attack is, that's going to come down to our political leaders and us as citizens making that distinction and making that determination. Whether that's empowering or not, it's an important thing to understand. Now, going forward and thinking about the idea of the response, another key point is just thinking about whether we overreacted, underreacted, or had the right reaction to these attacks. After the lockdown that we all experienced in various forms, whether you lived close by over here in Cambridge or just down the road, or you lived across the river, it seemed after the fact that there were a lot of people on the streets cheering and supporting the police and the FBI who had been involved in this operation. And I will say historically, capturing the individuals who seemed like they committed this attack that quickly is quite a phenomenal thing. That's pretty rare to have that happen so quickly. And so I think in that sense, the law enforcement should be commended. On the other hand of things, it's important to understand the fact that this is an operation that cost hundreds of millions of dollars. It perhaps set a precedent going forward that we're going to shut down a major city when an attack like this happens. And some people have raised the question of, well, if you're a guy with a couple of pressure cooker bombs, do you decide to attack Boston or attack somewhere else like this, knowing that you can get this type of response? Is this something that's just a one-time deal, or is this something that we're prepared to do again and again? And is, in that sense, the fact that we're acting in a fearful way something that gives these individuals who are able to put or willing to put bombs at the feet of small children more than they're actually worth, or more of a response than they should actually get? I think these are important questions to talk about. And obviously, in the days after an attack, a lot of us are kind of still in a grieving phase where we're thinking about the people who are still in the hospital having lost limbs. We're thinking about the families who have lost loved ones, people in the MIT community who knew the police officer who was, cowardly way gunned down. But nonetheless, it's important to think about how do we actually want to respond to this stuff? Because this has precedent not just for treating people like enemy combatants or not, but also in terms of, as a society, how are we going to deal with this when attacks like this happen again, as unfortunately they inevitably probably will. In Boston, it's not like living in London. We're not taped publicly every day when we're on the streets with cameras, etc., but that's changing. In the T's, when you're in the subway stations, that's happening more and more. I guarantee you that's going to happen more and more on the streets of Boston. We need to think about as a society if that's something we want to do. What about domestic drones? What about reading emails? Are these types of things that we think are too big of an infringement on our civil liberties, or are these infringements that we're willing to deal with to be more safe? Important things to think about. I'm still on the MIT network for texts that come on what's going on the campus. And I'll tell you, if you guys are as well, I've been getting seemingly 2 or 3 texts a day about suspicious packages on campus. Now, in the one sense, that's great because I would like to have transparency about what's going on. I know that MIT has security officers that are here taking care of us, and that's a great thing. On the other end of things, if that's happening every day, is that kind of making us more fearful than we otherwise should be about something that's actually a pretty low likelihood event? Again, these are things that we don't necessarily talk about all the time because politically it's very difficult to bring this up, but it's nonetheless something that I think we need to debate if we want to talk about the effectiveness of these attacks and how we're going to respond to them as a society. In terms of overall, what my takeaway point from this will be is simply that I'm not going to counsel one way or the other in terms of over or under reaction, unless you want to talk about it more in the Q&A, but I will say this. I'm incredibly confident that having more knowledge about when and why these things happen, how they're actually effective or not, and what we can do about them is going to lead to better answers as a society and how we deal with terrorism and counterterrorism going forward. So in that sense, I'm actually quite encouraged by the people who are here today, getting both historical context as we have from the speakers before, as well as understanding the broader context of individuals and groups who have committed violence like this before, knowing both what it can achieve, what it cannot achieve, and what at the end of the day we get to decide in terms of whether it will have a broader significant political impact or not. Thank you very much.
Hello. I'd like to thank the organizers for getting us all together. These are wonderful educational opportunities, I think, for all of us here, but certainly for the community at large. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit concerning the legal framework for what has happened. You might have noticed that on April 21, the FBI issued or appealed for a complaint against Dzhokhar Tsarnaev under what's called Title 18, which is the federal code, Title 18. And you might have been a little bit surprised to learn that it was with relevance to the use of a weapon of mass destruction. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is why are we into the realm of weapon of mass destruction? Is that how we usually think? The second thing I'm going to talk about is the FBI and its changing structure after 9/11. The FBI that we have today, in terms of its emphasis on intelligence as opposed to criminal investigation, and also the level of science that you find, bioforensics, forensics in general, is really, really different from if you go back to, for example, just the year 2000. And also there's been a change in the training and emphasis of special agents and people who are intelligence analysts. So that's one part. Those are two parts. And then the third part I'd like to talk about is profiling and what the FBI has done with profiling and why they ever do it and how far you can get with it. And I should say here that my background is really the study of the 2001 anthrax letter attacks, which is how I learned over the course of about 8 years what the FBI does, because I didn't really understand until I became involved with the anthrax letter attacks as a research subject, what this big institution does. So let me start with Title 18. Why Title 18? Title 18 is part of the federal code for criminal violations, and although we, since about 1947, have used weapons of mass destruction to refer to particularly biological and chemical weapons, and also nuclear weapons. We entered a new phase in terms of the code around the year 2000, I think was a real turning point, with the bombing of the USS Cole over in Yemen. And then even more of a turning point with the Timothy McVeigh bombing of the building in Oklahoma City. Both of those events were for the Department of Justice and for the FBI, and I think for the government in general, US government in general, very important, because what they showed was that you could have a mass effect on US soldiers, the US Navy, and then you could have a mass effect on these people who were working in a government building. And that is the point at which you begin to see what we would call now fairly radical revisions in terms of the federal code. So mass attack, right? You can go back, by the way, into the 80s. You can see these changes happening. But mass attack is now written into Title 18 for the use of explosives. So it's very specific. It says biological weapons, the use of biological weapons. It says the use of chemical weapons. And then it doesn't say the use of nuclear weapons, by the way. It says because we have a particular approach to nuclear weapons, so it does not refer to the use of nuclear weapons as a crime, because we don't believe that. We have not ascribed to that particularly. But it does refer to the release of radiation or radioactivity at a level dangerous to human life. So that's the phrasing out of the code. Now, you might have seen in the complaint that the FBI issued that it refers also to a section 844I. And what it is referring to here is very specifically the destruction of property to the point of death. So you have actually two features in the complaint. One of them is the use of a bomb, so that it causes mass casualties. And the other one is this use of a weapon, in this case a bomb, which causes property damage to property to the point of death. So you can have the death and the property thing together. The person who would be brought to court, brought to trial under this complaint, could be charged with both. And it looks from the complaint as it stands now that Tsarnaev would be charged with both. What's interesting here is the first one is a life imprisonment or death penalty level, right, of accusation, of prosecution. The property damage is not. All right, so you'll have two different features probably running through the trial. Interesting here, if the defendant pleads guilty to either of those, the issue of the death penalty disappears, and it goes down to life imprisonment, because that's required, because there were deaths. But for the property damage one, it becomes a certain number of years. So it's interesting. It's not as simple a case, actually, as it looks right now, or as you might think. There is in Title 18 what we all know, because from watching CSI or watching any reading detective novels, anything, there is murder in the first degree, and then there is second-degree murder. Everything else is second degree. But murder in the first degree under Title 18 is characterized as in conventional law in the United States, malice aforethought, with a murder or perpetrated with malice aforethought. That is, there has to be planning in it. It has to be something that was, where there's evidence that it was not done in a spirit of passion or by impulse, that it's something that was actually planned out. And with that, it is either the death penalty or life imprisonment. Okay, so if it's murder one, as we say, under this Title 18, there is no 20 years in jail or 40 years in jail or anything like that. It really is life imprisonment, or it is the death penalty. The death penalty can only be the judgment if the Attorney General of the United States says that the death penalty will be pursued. And so Holder has the option to say, wherever this trial would take place, just life imprisonment, not the death penalty. I don't think he's going to do that, but that is an option that the Attorney General has. So the Attorney General has that option, but it is up to the local jury, wherever the trial takes place. The local jury is actually takes the role of the decision maker. So the local jury, where will the local jury be? And I think we all understand it has to be in a place where the members of that jury are not familiar with anyone, do not know anyone who was harmed in this event. So that's going to be tricky because people came from all over Massachusetts. So there may be a question of, will this trial be taken away? Will it go someplace else? So these are some of the complexities that will come up. And this is all out of Title 18. Now, let me just go very quickly to what the FBI has become since 9/11. And this has already been alluded to. How good is our intelligence? Well, you might remember that after 9/11, President Bush was on television blaming the FBI because, in fact, the Al-Qaeda perpetrators had attacked the Twin Towers. Now, 4 days before 9/11, the present director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, was actually sworn into office by that same president. So Robert Mueller comes in. He's new. It wasn't on his watch, right? But he has become, over the years, a person whose main idea is to turn the FBI into a counterterrorism organization, which also has increased enormously and will keep increasing enormously its capacity to do intelligence work. Now, why is that even interesting? Well, that's interesting because the history of the FBI is the history of agents who do criminal investigations. That's what it was there for. And that's a very different mission. To do a criminal investigation, you have something terrible happens, then you send out your special agents into the field. They begin the process of interviewing witnesses. They begin the process of forensics. They begin building the basis for trial-worthy evidence. Very important. You have to think always as an investigator out in the field that everything you're doing is building towards that time when the prosecution is there in court, the prosecutor is there, and they are making the case against that defendant. That's the main intent, right, that people in the FBI for generations have been educated to as their expertise and as their mission. Intelligence is very different, as I think we all understand. Intelligence is a long-range and much more highly secret, by the way, endeavor, which is supposed to let you know sources of information in very disparate parts of the world or within crime networks. So can the FBI do intelligence? Absolutely. In fact, that has been the main transition. There have been structural changes within the FBI which have enhanced the intelligence component. The FBI and the CIA meet together now under the general umbrella of federal intelligence. The training of agents, even field agents, into the methods of intelligence has increased. The numbers of intelligence analysts has doubled since 9/11. And the whole momentum, if you look at it now, and even the list of priorities that the FBI issues, puts intelligence and counterterrorism very, very high up. And of course, there are over 70 overseas offices or postings for FBI agents, so they're working all the time overseas. Have they worked well enough overseas to prevent what happened on April 15th? Well, of course not. Of course not. Not a perfect organization, but an organization that has really dramatically changed. Now, just very quickly, let me just say a few things about profiling. There have been other instances that look like this particular event in terms of the perpetrators. And you might remember the Beltway snipers, all right? So you had Mohammed and Malcolm were the two, the perpetrators, and they eventually come to trial, and one of them, it's the older man and the younger man, by the way, they have figured out a system of attack out of the back of a car, which is a random attack on white people, by the way. But if you looked into their emails and their other communications, you find that jihadist rhetoric was very, very strong. It was all in the list of, for example, what the prosecution presented. It was amazing how much the rhetoric there was and how much passion there was invested in the notion of a jihad against Americans and a jihad particularly against whites. All right, so that's maybe a sort of an analogous case. That comes down to a folie à deux case. It's a case of, it's not a lone wolf, there are two. And so then what are the larger ramifications of that? Is that really the good analogy that we want? Well, profiling is very tricky business. It starts in the FBI in the 1980s as a real profession, if you will, within the FBI because of rape cases. They decided in the 1980s that if there was an unidentified rapist, maybe they could track a rapist by profiling and then using the profile as a way of identifying people who maybe knew the victim. So that's the sort of the beginning of profiling. It's way, way beyond that now. It's very sophisticated. And in the case of Bruce Ivins, who was the prime suspect in the anthrax letter attacks, the profiling was at a level that was really very hard to have even imagined 10 or 15 or 20 years before. And this happened in part because he was an employee of the Department of Defense, and he had signed a statement before he committed suicide in 2008 that let his mental health records, everything he had ever had in terms of therapy sessions or drugs he had taken or anything that he had done in terms of mental health would be open for government perusal. Now, they didn't look at any of those records while he was alive and while he was a suspect, but after the fact, there is now an entire book which profiles this man, Bruce Ivins, in incredible detail. And what's interesting to me is what you find with him and what you seem to find as a pattern with all of the lone wolves, but also with group terrorists, are some of the things that Jessica Stern has mentioned, for example, when she's written about Islamic terrorists. A sense of inferiority, a sense of not being appreciated, alienation from the larger society, to the point of social rejection. All right, so that you look for that. Maybe that would be in a profile. The other thing that you see is impulsivity, a real disregard for risk, and that gets to be associated with young people. And we know this. I mean, you could go to the neuroscience here, but the human brain, up until about the age of 27, is really engineered, if you will, to take risks because this is a great learning time. After about age 27, the risk-taking goes down, but 19 is really 18, 19, 20, 21. These are ages when people, kids, are taking risks, all right? So impulsivity, ignorance of consequences, or not caring about consequences. And then there's something else, and this is very interesting to me because although there's enormous amount of work being done on the brain, the amygdala, impulsivity, depression, all of these things, we're beginning to understand these things so much better. But when I was writing about Bruce Ivins, I went back to William James, philosopher William James, who wrote a wonderful essay many, many years ago called The Divided Self. And in that essay, he talks about the tension in modern life between an interior life where you know who you are, you know you're flawed, and you know that you don't meet the expectations of other people, and the ideal you, that other you that should be out there, who should maybe be famous or should be totally virtuous or should be saint-like, that other person you know you're not, but you want to be, but you can't be. And so I'm going to end here by reading this sentence from William James. And he's referring to somebody who has this dilemma. And he says, "The man's interior is a battleground for what he feels to be two deadly hostile selves, one actual, the other ideal. And this is something which intrigues me about both of these brothers, but I can assure you that you find it as a pattern through most of the other cases that I know of, where you see this mass killing, this mass murders, right? These are mass murders, and who perpetrates them. I just want to end on one thing, by the way. When we talk about how unusual the quick solution of this case was, and how we're all very grateful to the people in the FBI and the police force and everyone who came forward and helped, I think that's true. But look at the story again. Every bit of crucial information, from the identification of the both brothers, initially by the one victim who lost his legs, that's the beginning part, to the man who was captured by them for 90 minutes in the van and then escaped, right? Absolutely crucial. To all the people who took the footage, to the surveillance camera. That was not FBI work, and that was not police work. That was what we call, collective intelligence. That was the public, and that I thought was absolutely splendid. And I think without all of that participation, you really would not have had this case come to a climax, or at least have the suspects in hand as quickly. So I'm very appreciative to everything law enforcement did, but the public in this case was, to my mind, the big difference. Thank you. Oh, should I say Sylvia's coming? Sylvia is following up on profiles and much more.